Welcome to the roundtable for the 20th of, what month are we in? June. I can't believe how fast summer's going. We've got Sean Speer, co-founder and editor-at-large, in the studio today.
Yeah, it's always great to be here with you and the team.
You are going to miss a bit of a heat wave hitting Toronto in the coming days. But, talk about going from what's the expression? From the frying pan into the fire. You're heading down to New York where your family is living right now. I understand, Sean, it is going to be a sweatbox for you and your kids.
Yeah, my wife hates the heat in New York, and she's going to experience it in the next week or so. We're up around 36, 37 degrees Celsius every day. So, yeah, a lot of ice cream I think we'll be having at our house.
And as a Thunder Bay native, I guess this is all just like payback for your childhood.
Yeah.
You're just bathing out there. You've got your stomach. You're rubbing it down in cocoa oil and just roasting on the sidewalk in Harlem.
That's precisely right. I'm one of these people, Roger, who thinks I've done my time with winter. If I had my way, we would be moving the hub headquarters further south.
Yeah.
I could live without winter ever again.
Well, I encourage our listeners and viewers to check out your article on why we lost the Stanley Cup. Talk about moving further south. Lower taxes, a big reason why these Florida teams are dominating. But we won't go there, but a terrific op-ed for you to, for our listeners to check out. On the first half of the show, Sean, I want to talk about the growing phenomena of elbows down, which is kind of sweeping through the media and publishing and other establishment in Canada. It really is a remarkable reversal. So let's get into that on the first half of the show. And then the second half, where we join for the private part of the roundtable with our Hub Heroes and Hub Fellows, special guest you had in this studio yesterday. We're going to reveal who that is and what they said on the back half of the show exclusively for our Hub Heroes and Hub Fellows. But let's talk about elbows down. What do you make of this? You and I think both were triggered a bit by a column by Lawrence Martin of the Globe and Mail. We'll include a link to it in today's show notes. Tell us what was in the column that kind of particularly fired you up.
Well, Martin, in a way, personifies, I think, conventional wisdom through the first quarter of this year. If you opened up the opinion page of the Globe and Mail, you would have been overwhelmed with columns and op-eds about how this was Canada's moment to stand up to America. And not only did we collectively need to rethink our relationship with the U.S. and everything that involves, but individually we needed to exercise these acts of resistance, including, not buying stuff from Amazon or canceling trips to the United States or whatever. And I think it's fair to say at the Hub, we thought a lot of this was performative and silly, that whatever one thought of Trump and whatever one thought of his poise towards us, Canada's relationship with the United States is fundamental, and we needed to have our heads and think about how we manage this issue. And that's not what we got from our opinion elite, and it's not what we got from Mark Carney. It was all elbows up. It was the end of the relationship and reconceptualizing the world and all the rest. Mm-hmm. And of course, since the election, we've seen something different. The Prime Minister Carney, in a lot of ways, has done what we would have advised: compromising when appropriate, standing up when appropriate. But what's fascinating is that opinion climate that contributed to this frenzy of nationalism and patriotism and elbows up is now gradually walking it back in the face of the Carney government's handling of these issues. And Lawrence Martin was a personification of the elbows up culture to start. And this silly column of his where he talks about the strategic benefits of elbows down is a personification of now the inevitable retreat that was so predictable in the winter.
The column is especially ripe, as we like to say in the media business. I mean, it talks about how Mark Carney at the G7, was very astute and wise in his handling of Trump and not confronting Trump and in a sense, being the junior partner. It was a remarkable, again, as you say, reversal from the chest-thumping rhetoric that Martin Lawrence and other opinion pages in the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, a lot of mainstream press, thundered out over the course of the election again and again and again, that this was, a existential crisis.
Yes.
I mean, people were musing
during
the election about Canada restarting its nuclear program to acquire a bomb.
Yes.
I mean, this is how
military draft.
Yeah, crazy and unhinged people became.
Yes.
And what do you explain, Sean, the volte-face, the extent to which these so-called, wizards of conventional wisdom who I guess are paid all this money to be columnists precisely because they have some perspicacity, some ability to see into the future, are now doing, somersaults before our eyes, rhetorically and otherwise. What explains it? Is it simply proximity to power, wanting to be, I don't know, seen as relevant, seen as responsive to a new prime minister? Does access depend on this in a way? Does Lawrence Martin, I don't know if he ever got his calls returned by PMO, but are you more likely to get the inside track because, hey, you're towing, the government in power's line?
Yeah, I think there's something to that, but I would say two things. First of all, when in the business of commenting on policy and politics, you're going to get things wrong. Lord knows we've got things wrong here, but we've tried to be accountable for it, right? We've gone back and we've talked about where we were wrong, where we made mistakes. One of the things I think that frustrates a lot of people about the legacy media is there's just no accountability. Lawrence Martin's column didn't say, shucks. I must admit, back in January and February, when I was talking about the imminent threat of American invasion, I probably was overstating things in hindsight, and this approach is a more sensible. None of that. There's no accountability. There's no introspection, as you say. It's just like moving from A to B with the same kind of certitude that one had in the previous moment. The second thing is, I think for a lot of conservatives, you can start to persuade yourself that this was almost a conspiracy, and I don't mean that in an organized way, but that the crisis was manufactured by political actors, opinion leaders, and others. We were poised to have an election about the lost decade. And that set of issues, of course,
Liberals would lose.
Advantage the conservatives.
Yeah.
And through January, February, March, April, the entire political climate changed, and we became singularly focused on this question. And opinion leaders like Lawrence Martin were part of creating that climate that clearly advantaged the Liberals. And now, when it no longer does, they're changing their tune. And as I say, one can understand why some conservatives would think that there's more to just this being a mere coincidence.
Yeah, people are starting to throw around, partly in jest, but partly not in a way, this idea of regime media.
Yes.
And I think it's look, people will flip out now in the YouTube comments because I've used this phrase, regime media, to kind of describe a very supplicating and kind of docile mainstream press that tracks, almost identically to the political preferences of what is usually now, for going on a decade plus, a liberal government who is in power. And I think that's where the rhetoric of regime media comes from. It comes frustration from conservatives to not seeing their preferences either expressed politically or expressed by a media that, as we know, is subsidized to the tune of roughly half of all their journalists' salaries being paid for by one type of government legislation or direct funding or others. I guess the question is, does the media risk a blowback? I think of the United States and these revelations that have come out of the extent of Joe Biden's decline and the degree to which this was covered up. Talk about an established press, a mainstream media press, tracking to the political preferences and advantages of an incumbent party who has an ideology that resonates conveniently with their own, assumptions about how the world should work. I see some parallels here between the Biden decline, the cover up there, and a risk to the mainstream press that this is a bit jarring for Canadians. If you're suddenly told that the sky is falling and the country, is literally on the verge of being invaded by the Americans, and we have a moment of national crisis that must be met with, as you say, a draft, a nuclear bomb, these bizarre suppositions, and then suddenly, 90 days later, they're telling you, no, actually, elbows down. Our prime minister is right. Maybe we're also hearing now we'll need to make major concessions to The Americans, there was an Economist story that was published and
Yes.
then pulled.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us about that?
Yeah, talked about giving the United States first right of refusal on access to Canadian resources. That may be a good idea or a bad idea if it's critical to maintaining mostly tariff-free access to the U.S. market. But that is a 180 from what we were talking about through the election. What about the Golden Dome?
Yes, we've written about that. How dumb as a bag of hammers.
Fair.
Yeah. But again, a lot of the press is now saying, well, maybe we should spend tens of billions of dollars on an intercontinental missile defense system that has no sign that technologically or otherwise that it'll work, just to placate Trump.
And grants extraordinary Canadian sovereignty over to the U.S. administration when it comes to the defense of Canada's air. I mean, I think the parallel with Biden is an interesting one. I think you're onto something there, Rudyard. And what we've seen in the aftermath in the United States is serious damage to already declining trust and confidence in legacy media institutions. I think that Martin's column, we're picking on him, but only because it reflects, I think, this broader shift in the way that a lot of opinion leaders, including in the legacy media, are now characterizing Canada's relationship with the U.S. in a way that, as we've been discussing, feels like they helped to manufacture a crisis, and now that crisis is so self-evidently not manifesting itself, they are gradually unwinding it. And as you say, it just so happens that in both instances, it advantages the government.
Yeah, either way. Two final points. One, I think we always have to remember that Mark Carney, when he was governor of the Bank of England, to his critics, was a major participant in something called Project Fear, which was to convince the British people not to Brexit on the basis that it would cause profound economic hardship. And to Mark Carney's credit, I think he was right. I think Nigel Farage and a lot of the alt-right conservative movement in the UK was wrong about the economic consequences of Brexit. But I guess what I've always thought a bit about Mark Carney is that he must have learned a lot from that experience. He must have learned, in a sense, how publics react to powerful figures like a governor of the Bank of England, in that case, engaging in public debate and in the public square, interacting with the media around ideas of fear, of risk, of the unknown. And you think you take all that muscle memory and then he mapping that over to the Canadian election. It's kind of like a guy showed up with a black belt on that maybe the Conservatives and others were unaware of. And I mean, this is my final question to you. I mean, we're beating up on the media, but in some ways, maybe the media has met a master here, a political master trained, in the snake pit of UK public opinion and media, which is vicious, and who was far better maybe than we realized at first in stoking fear, in creating a sense of crisis. The language that he used, the elbows up, reciprocal tariffs that then suddenly never really appeared. All this stuff you can go through and see it all, and a media maybe that played along with that. And again, I think risks now kind of having the rug proverbially pulled out from under its feet.
I think that's brilliant. When Mark Carney announces his candidacy for the Liberal leadership, it is a 0% probability that he becomes the Prime Minister after an election, right? It appeared to be a suicide mission. I went back and looked. We're speaking today on June 20th. On January 19th, there was betting markets had a 90% probability that Pierre Poilievre was going to become the next Prime Minister. And so Mark Carney he was making this bank shot, right? It was an improbable quest, but it relied on one thing: creating the conditions that Canadians would be drawn, as you've put it, to safety. This election ultimately was an expression of a flight to safety. And the only way you could create those conditions is if you persuaded enough people that there was enough fear and risk that you were in search of safety. And so in that sense, Carney's ability, with the support of opinion leaders and writers and so on, to create that sense of fear and risk was crucial, fundamental, pivotal to him fulfilling what on the face of it was a completely improbable path to the prime ministership.
Yeah, and now we'll see whether the media challenges him, because that's what we're doing here at the Hub. People, I'm sure the YouTube comments are blowing up right now, Sean, with people saying these guys are, trashing Carney. We're not, but we're simply saying that the media has a role here, historically and in this instance, which is to hold governments to account. And if Mr. Carney and the Liberals said that this was the greatest crisis of our generation, of his generation, of our generation, and now suddenly it's not, then I think we're owed an explanation.
Yes.
And I don't think it's, I think the Lawrence Martins and the Globe and Mail, a fantastic paper, our paper of record, we acknowledge it. They should be holding him to account when we start getting these policy decisions, these policy pronouncements that would suggest that the crisis suddenly is over.
Yeah.
In fact, we're going in the opposite direction than what he promised during the election.
Yeah, I don't mean to have the first segment go too long, but
No.
but a ton of insight there. Just 2 quick points. First of all, not only should they hold him accountable, they should hold themselves accountable. What went wrong? Why were they drawn into that narrative? And secondly, I think you're right. The government owes us an explanation for what has changed relative to the way they were thinking and talking about these issues. It's worth saying that a lot of the things that the Prime Minister is doing vis-a-vis the Trump administration, we broadly agree with.
Yeah.
The problem isn't what he's actually doing. The problem is the gap or the gulf between what he's doing and what he told Canadians. We were always, I think, I don't want to speak for you, but I was always inclined
to forego reciprocal tariffs.
And to try to recognize that notwithstanding how much one might not like Trump and what he was doing, that it was in Canada's best interest ultimately to find some kind of arrangement, however suboptimal. And in that sense, I think the Carney government deserves credit for being for recognizing what's
being realistic.
Precisely.
Yeah, but realism, comes at best with honesty.
Yes.
And, to be an idealist one day and a realist next is a little cognitively disassociating, at least for me, Sean, to put it politely. Well, let's say goodbye to our complimentary listeners. If you're enjoying the Hub Roundtable, we'd love to have you on the back half of the show, where we're going to reveal a really special guest who was in this studio yesterday, what they said to us, and give you a heads up on a newsmaker interview that'll be landing in the Hub on Monday. You can get that interview, the second half of this show, all of it, by becoming a Hub Hero for as little as $1 a week. You can do that right now on our website, www.thehub.ca. As soon as you sign up, we will send you a link so you can listen to the back half of the show immediately on your favorite podcast app. So thanks for tuning in and watching on YouTube and listening to this, the first half of the Roundtable, free on our podcast feed. I'll say goodbye now. Bye-bye.